Hi, I'm Rose Aguilar. You're listening to the Authoritarian Playbook, a special series from KALW Public Media. During the 2024 election, we aired Project 2025 that explored the Heritage Foundation's far-right plan for a potential second Trump presidency. Throughout the campaign, the Trump team distanced themselves from Project 2025 and claimed they knew nothing about it. But the Trump administration is now packed with Project 2025 architects. Our new series, The Authoritarian Playbook, looks at how the administration is moving with unprecedented speed to turn Project 2025 into a reality that is fundamentally reshaping the United States government. Every week, we'll summarize the latest developments, put them in historical context, and find out how people and organizations are responding. One note before we begin: when this show originally aired live on KALW, listeners were encouraged to call in. If you have a comment or perspective to share about this series, please email authoritarianplaybook@kalw.org. Today, we continue our new series, The Authoritarian Playbook. Today, we are speaking with artists to find out how they are fighting authoritarianism and the Trump administration's attacks on the arts. In February, Trump took control of the Kennedy Center, firing programming staff and appointing himself as chair of the board, which pushed ticket sales to their lowest levels in years. In May, the administration canceled over $27 million in National Endowment for the Arts grants, devastating artists and nonprofits across the country. In August, the administration called for a, quote, comprehensive internal review of 8 Smithsonian museums. They are now threatening to withhold federal funding from the Smithsonian Institution if they do not comply with an unprecedented push for censorship. Many large cultural institutions are operating under a constant fear of being targeted or censored. So if that is happening to large cultural institutions, imagine what it is like for medium and small institutions. But given all of this, artists across the country are leading a movement of creative resistance to authoritarianism. And 3 of them are here with us today: Laura Raicovich, Joe Kreiter, and Eric Kupers. Laura Raicovich is a New York City-based writer and curator. Most recently, she curated the Counter Public Convening in St. Louis, a free weekend festival bringing together artists and advocates to imagine new ways of being in the world together. She's initiator of Fall of Freedom, a national call for cultural resistance in the U.S. Laura Raicovich's book, Culture Strike: Art and Museums in an Age of Protest, is being translated into several languages. Hi, Laura. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Great to have you. Joe Kreiter is artistic director of Flyaway Productions, a company that makes dances that are site-specific, off-the-ground, and justice-driven. Flyaway Productions has made dances about a number of important topics, including the prison industrial complex, reproductive rights, and the history of the transgender uprising at 111 Taylor Street in San Francisco. Joe Kreiter is a choreographer and site artist with a background in political science. She's director of Girlfly, an artist as activist summer program for young people. Flyaway is working on an upcoming performance called Freedom Comes When One Walks Through It. Hi, Joe. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Rose. Great to reconnect with you.
It's so great to hear your voice and reconnect, Joe. Thank you so much. We're also joined by Eric Kupers, professor of inclusive performance and theater and dance at California State University, East Bay. Eric Kupers' primary choreography and performance work has been with Dandelion Dancetheater, which he co-founded in 1996 with Kimiko Guthrie. Dandelion is situated at the crossroads of dance, theater, music, writing, community activism, healing, and new performance forms. Eric Kupers is a member of the People vs. Project 2025, a national organization campaign designed to connect, amplify, and mobilize artists and cultural workers that are confronting Project 2025. If you're in New York City, they're having an event this Sunday at 9:30 a.m. at the Alliance of Resident Theaters. Hi, Eric. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us. You have been doing this really important work for decades. I'm just curious, in this second Trump administration, how has this really affected you as an artist and changed the way you think about your work? Joe, let's start off with you as someone who does these incredible dance pieces about issues from the prison industrial complex to reproductive rights. How has this really changed the way you see your work?
Well, I think my answer is very personal. I I feel a little less trust in myself. I feel like trust in myself is being like beaten out of me, so to speak, just because the news every day is so assaultive. It's so impactful in a bad way. You know, every day there's something new. We woke up this weekend to an invasion and kidnapping of someone in another country that leads, so I, there's something about this very personal, like the little cartoon of the figure with the little hammer beating over the thing's head, and they go down and down and down. That's kind of how I feel, and so I wake up every day trying to counter that. The other thing I'll say is that I have not paused at all the work that I do, to abolish the prison system. That is continuing despite everything that's happening in the world, but it's a much harder work.
Right. And we'll talk about that throughout the show because we heard that from listeners last year that the news was coming at you so fast. It felt like whiplash and it was dark and really heavy. And we've all felt it here. And for that reason, for our mental health and for everyone's mental health, we're going to spend more time on more positive shows. And what I mean by that is like universal childcare in New Mexico, first state to do it. How did they do it? Community organizing on the ground. Like you say, Joe, so many people working to make sure that young people do not go to prison, to abolish the prison industrial complex. So to try to also focus on the good work that people are doing. Because Joe, don't you think it's so easy to get lost in all of these headlines? I mean, we've done it. I've done it.
Yeah, it's hard to feel like you have momentum. And one of the things that really helps that is hyper-local organizing. In the dance community, we have the first thing we did when Trump got elected was come together and, met a bunch of dance artists, a random, intergenerational, multiracial bunch of dance artists. And we now call ourselves loosely Artist Solidarity Action, and are engaged with funders right now, actually, to look at the minutia and the bigger picture of small arts organization and independent artist survival in this context. And so, that is, you're silenced by the headlines, by the news, by everything that's happening that's designed. I mean, authoritarianism silences. So when you reach out, when you connect with your peers, when you make something happen, no matter how small, it is resistance. And that is the one place that I find comfort, that I find, the faith to keep going. And Bay Area artists amaze me. I adore, especially working intergenerationally now that I am on the older end of the spectrum of arts making. It's what young people are doing and bringing energy to. And I feel incredible responsibility to caretake for younger artists because, I wasn't facing authoritarianism when I was in my 30s and like pushing against all the usual obstacles to get your work out there.
Yeah, and I'd love to talk about this later in the show, Joe, especially your engagement with funders, what you're hearing, and then what you're hearing from young people. Joe Kreiter is artistic director of Flyaway Productions. They make incredible dance performances that are site-specific, off the ground, and justice-driven. We're also joined by Laura Raicovich, a New York City-based writer and curator. And Laura, you were just involved in Counterpublic convening in St. Louis. This was a festival bringing together artists to talk about new ways of being in the world. So what would you like to talk about? How is this all affecting you and the way you think about your work?
Well, I have been really obsessed with the idea of working with alternative cultural infrastructures for the last several years. I used to be the director of the Queens Museum here in New York, and I spent many years inside of more what I would say are classical cultural institutions, classical museum spaces. And what I recognize, and I want to pick this up from what Joe was saying, is the profound need to create solidarity networks in this moment. Yes, to the hyperlocal, yes, to deep working together and community building, and then also connecting those dots between us across regions, across states, because there is great power in that. And the St. Louis, I was very curious about. And what I mean by alternative cultural infrastructure is that, I worked for a long time in museums, and, there are definitely barriers to entry for a lot of folks who just don't feel like it's a place for them. And I think there is a real problem around the bigger cultural narrative around culture and art in the United States, particularly, but I think also across the world. But it's particularly sharp in the United States because of the history of funding of culture in the US, which is that it actually literally isn't for everybody. And this narrative is pervasive in part because, there is so little public funding for culture that people just push it out of their minds. They're like, oh, that's for those elite people over there who are wealthy, and they manage the taste piece and they dictate what's in the cultural spaces anyway. And the problem with that is not obviously just the obvious, class-based problematics there, but it also convinces people that what they do every day, which is all of us produce culture all the time, we are all culture makers, is that their culture somehow is not as important or relevant or worthy as this other culture that's featured in these sort of classical cultural spaces. And so we end up with a story about culture that eliminates the culture that we all produce all the time, whether we're grocery shopping or making dinner with for our families, or taking a walk with a friend. Like, we are producing culture. That's what humans do, and we need to kind of reintegrate art and life. And so my project in St. Louis was called The Circus of Life, and we literally created a circus in a series of circus tents in downtown St. Louis, and because I really wanted to kind of erase a lot of those barriers to entry. It was free, anybody could come. Your attitude, just thinking about, just when you say the word museum and when you say the word circus, different things come to mind. And it's not to say that a circus is better than a museum. It's to say that we also need circus. And some artists, those in whose work I am very interested, is very committed to sociality and those social connections and those conversations that we need to be having right now. And those are the artists whose work feels very strange and strained in the museum, but perhaps in a circus, when you walk in and you're like expecting something to be weird, is a little bit more like, oh, okay, that was kind of odd, and it wasn't in a gold frame, but okay, like, I'm gonna vibe with that. So people can get into it more and feel like their authentic response is actually meaningful. And that's where we begin to make meaning together. And I think that, like, this piece around solidarity, around what Joe was talking about this intergenerational quality that's so compelling about the work that I think we all do, is that you get to feel that meaning making that you're co-creating. And to me, that's what can happen in a space like the Circus of Life, and also like the Fall of Freedom project that I also was a part of initiating this fall, which I can talk more about later.
Yeah, I would love to learn more about the Fall of Freedom. That is Laura Raicovich, a New York City-based writer and curator. We're also joined today by Eric Kupers, professor of inclusive performance and theater and dance at Cal State University East Bay, and is a choreographer and performance artist with Dandelion Dancetheater, which he co-founded in 1996. So, Eric, you come at this from an interesting perspective as an artist, but also as a professor at Cal State University East Bay. So, how is this moment really affecting the work that you do and how you think about it?
Well, I think building on what Laura said, I see this time as a time of great opportunity. I feel more inspired and sort of validated in working in what I call inclusive performance, because I think as horrible as many of the things are that are happening right now in this country and around the world, it's there's also an aspect of it of that we're in a time of collapse and a time of renewal, and that we can. There's an opportunity here to renew how we do things, and so when the pandemic started, and I think the pandemic is very tied into all the political mishigas that's happening right now. When the pandemic started, there was this sense of like, oh my God, we can't go to theaters, we can't go to all these places that we're used to going to do art, and that was hard. And but it also felt like this amazing opportunity to rethink how we come together and what is the purpose of dance and theater and art and music. And could this be the moment where things become more inclusive? And my work is a lot based in bringing together people with and without disabilities, all shapes and sizes and ages and cultures and ancestries, and to kind of return the arts to the people as a birthright, that there's not such thing as a dancer and a non-dancer, or a musician and a non-musician, that we are all inherently creative, artistic beings. And how can we get back to that? And so while many of the funding cuts and the censorship programs are really challenging right now, there's another part of it that I think is pushing us as a human culture around the world to find new ways, or perhaps go back to very old ways of doing art, where art and activism aren't separate things, and where we're not suddenly jumping into gear to fight fascism, but that our art is always a statement for humanity, for affirming life, for inclusion, for compassion, and to sort of not get too caught up in fighting. It's important to oppose, I think, unjust things, but also to remember that we need to bring forth new visions that can replace fascism, that can replace authoritarianism, that bring us all in.
I wonder how you all describe and think about what has really happened over the past 5-10 years. I think a lot about the murder of George Floyd and the backlash to the uprising we saw after that. And in the middle, there were so many important conversations about what is art, who is it for, museums, ballet, who is ballet for? And the backlash was just so swift. And I just wonder how you think about that time. Hyperallergic has a really important piece out from Isa Farfan last month called How Trump Impacted Arts and Culture in 2025. And in January, the Smithsonian and National Gallery of Art, both federally funded, shuttered their DEI departments in compliance with an executive order signed by Trump just days after taking office. And I think, Joe, let's start with you. I think it's so important to remember that we saw so many needed changes after the murder of George Floyd across the arts world. I mean, I saw so many pieces in the Times and the Post about how museums were finally reaching out to Native people to say, you know what, we're sorry. A lot of these exhibits they're so outdated, and we want more diversity on our boards, and we want more people making decisions. And this was across the art world. And then the response was so swift. Can you just remind us of some of those incredible changes that we saw? I just think it's important not to forget about that time.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Rose. The first thing I thought of was I heard Brian Stevenson on the radio, another radio station, recently, and he was being interviewed, and the interview was very cynical. And he was like, no, you have to look at the cycles of how things have gotten better, Reconstruction after slavery, the civil rights movement after, lynchings. And I was really, and my heart grew when I heard someone like him, who's really seen some pretty hard stuff and lived through it, to be reminded that things do improve, things do change. And so that's kind of like a grounding for me. I would say that many of us have been doing work grounded in racial justice and gender justice long before George Floyd was killed. And I want to uplift artists who were already bringing that lens, and many in the Bay Area before that momentous day. And as you say, there was a massive sea change with the rise of Black Lives Matter and the rise of Black Lives Matter, led by three really amazing kick-ass women. And we saw a normalization of the expectation that one would work with racial justice embedded in your very being, in how you hired. I'll speak for myself, and how you hire dancers, how you pay people. I know one thing that Flyaway did was we, massively revised our contracts to reflect. We've always had attention to the best pay we can muster. So I'm going to just challenge Eric a little bit on the we don't need funding. Well, I need funding because I need to pay the people that work for me, dancers, crew, designers, a living wage, and that's really important to me. And so there's an onus on me to do a whole lot of fundraising to make that happen. And my work is expensive. But anyway, in our contracts, we also integrated much more socio-emotional care into the fabric of the contract. And I'm not sure we would have done that if not for this sea change in how people in the arts are asking to be treated, which is, like with basic human dignity. So those are just some things that come to mind in response to your question, Rose.
Thank you for that, Joe. We've actually had Brian Stevenson on a few times on the show, and I'm so glad you brought him up because I really want to go to Montgomery, Alabama to see the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. And it's to remember the people who were lynched. I'm on the website right now. More than 4,400 Black people killed in racial terror lynchings between 1877 and 1950 are remembered here. And I've watched shows about it. It's just a beautiful and such an important place. And if you're ever in that area, be sure to go in Montgomery, Alabama. So thank you, Joe. It is so important to look at the arc of history. And that's why I wanted to ask this question. Laura, what would you like to add about the work that people were doing before this country had a racial reckoning, but then also just the many changes that took place after the murder of George Floyd? What stands out for you?
I think it's really important in these conversations to kind of be careful about flattening the cultural world into one plane, because I think that, as you're saying, there were many people, and as Joe pointed out, there were many people doing this work really deeply and profoundly before that pivotal moment. I think it became normalized in a way and demanded in a way following the murder of George Floyd in ways that were really wonderful and fantastic. However, the backslide happens the quickest at the larger, more conservative institutions because just of who funds and governs those places. And so, I think in some ways, while I know that smaller and medium-sized organizations are getting hit very hard right now, I also think that they're sticking to their guns more. So, and that's part of why they're getting it harder. I think the backsliding that we're seeing in the more moneyed and more established institutions is not surprising. In my worldview here in New York City, the Metropolitan Museum of Art is not going to be leading the way in terms of its own racial justice internal work. That's going to fall to much more progressive, smaller organizations that can move the needle. But we did see incredible strides that I think have profoundly affected the way that places operate. I think that there was also a lot of lip service, frankly, a lot of DEI departments that sprung up and, were just like very, very thin, not for the fault of the people who were hired, but because they were just there to act as a fig leaf. I think that some of those have been eliminated, which is terrible, but they also they didn't have the institutional support to do the work that they really needed to do or wanted to do in the first place. So, I don't want to overstate the progress in some institutions, while I recognize that others, it became wildly more profound. I also want to just say that something that's been very important in this moment, as you know, as we've sort of transitioned from that kind of very hopeful moment of these ideas becoming much more normalized, and the backlash now against them, is that in my experiences, it has made people desire connection in a far more profound way. And I think coming out of the isolation of the pandemic, particularly, I've seen and experienced across a variety of different projects that I'm involved with, just a real desire of people to simply engage, and I think one of the most moving things from this Fall of Freedom project that unfolded this fall, where a group of artists and cultural producers got together in August and we're just like, we have to do something. American fascism is on the rise. We have to do something. We have to bring people together in some way. We didn't want to create some one more top-down organization that needed to be funded and structured and whatever. And so we decided to basically make an open call for people to participate in a national day of resistance, which meant not going to a protest, not signing a letter, but just making your art, doing your thing, doing it collectively, doing it with other people, coordinating with other people in your city, in your region, to make an impact by showing the force of the creative act, of culture and art as resistance. And I think that was really important because in a way, thousands and thousands of people participated in this. There were 2 days, November 21st, 20th and 21st. And thousands of people participated in 47 states. We had over 800 events registered on our website. Like, it was amazing. We had no idea that the response would be so profound. And we had so little time to organize. And so I think, and people are emailing us every day saying, what's next? What's next? And I think, that very simple yet open invitation to say, please come out, do what you do, got people going, because they were already, as Joe was talking about, so frustrated with everything, and it was just like, there was just this little drop of permission, quote unquote, that was given to say, like, okay, just come out and do your jam, like, be who you are. And people came out, and they want to come out again and again, and they want to do more. And I think this is so powerful. And this is why we know that fascist and authoritarian regimes go after arts and culture, because they recognize the power of that movement and that collective meaning making. And so bringing as many people into that fold as possible, I think, is very important. I think continuing in this decentralized way, where we're really fostering a piece of cultural infrastructure that can hold many, many, many multiple co-organizers in hundreds of cities and regions across the country, there is a power in that letting go of these old-fashioned leadership models requires. And I think that's the thing that we need to do right now, collectively and on a national scale, as well as hyper locally, because I think that's obviously the organizing all happens hyper locally. It's the rest of it that gets coordinated, across big geographies that then creates the possibilities for storytelling.
We're going to take a quick break on today's Authoritarian Playbook series. We're speaking with artists to find out how they are resisting and organizing. Today, we're joined by Laura Raicovich, a New York City-based writer and curator, Joe Kreiter, artistic director of Flyaway Productions, Eric Kupers, professor of inclusive performance at Cal State University East Bay, and co-founder of the Dandelion Dancetheater. Today, we continue our series, The Authoritarian Playbook. I'm Rose Aguilar. We'll be back after this. Today, we continue our series, The Authoritarian Playbook, discussing the Trump administration's authoritarian actions and policies. Like you, we just can't keep up. So every week, we'll summarize the latest news, put it in historical context, and find out how people are or are not responding. And we are speaking with artists to find out how they are resisting and organizing. Today, we're joined by Laura Raicovich, a New York City-based writer and curator. Joe Kreiter is artistic director of Flyaway Productions. Eric Kupers is co-founder of Dandelion Dancetheater and professor of inclusive performance at Cal State University East Bay. And Eric, I'd love to hear your thoughts about some of the more positive changes that you have seen over the years in the world, in the art world.
Sure. So first of all, I just want to clarify. I Joe mentioned I said we don't need funding, and I would never say that. I think we totally need funding, but and artists need funding much more than we've had. But my point was more about wanting to make sure we look closely at the systems for funding and that they are inclusive and equitable. And we're talking about sort of the changes since the time of the start of the pandemic and the murder of George Floyd, and how a lot of organizations and artists became much more socially conscious. And I think that was really positive and a good sort of first step for a lot of artists and organizations. But the thing that is most inspiring to me since before this hard time we're in and now is the day-to-day artists going into the studio, doing whatever the prep work is, making art in a very step-by-step, often very slow, often uncertain where it's headed way, that the simple act of us returning to our art making is, I think, hugely life-affirming and anti-authoritarianism. I want to just read a very quick quote, if that's okay, that I think relates to this conversation. It's by Adrienne Marie Brown from the book Emergent Strategy, which I think is must reading for anybody in these times. And she said, "There is such urgency in the multitude of crises we face. It can make it hard to remember that, in fact, it is urgency thinking, urgent, constant, unsustainable growth that got us to this point, and that our potential success lies in doing deep, slow, intentional work." And I think that's what artists do. That's what we do over and over and over again, when times are good, when times are hard, when other people see and validate our work, when no one sees and validates or understands what we're doing, we keep going. And so artists can be a kind of bedrock of sustaining life-affirming values through this time.
Yeah, thank you for that. And since you brought up funding, I'd love for you all to talk about funding and where we are right now. So the administration started canceling National Endowment for the Arts grants back in May. And so many people have been hit so hard by this. And Joe, we've had you on over the years just talking about how the United States really is an outlier. I mean, this was years before Trump. The amount that we spend per person on the arts is so small compared to other wealthy countries. So this isn't new, but it's reached a really big breaking point under Trump. Can you talk a bit about how funding has really changed over the years and what you have seen personally in trying to get grants, and then what you've heard from your colleagues?
I'd say the consistency with funding is that it's a constant and unpredictable roller coaster, which makes it very difficult to plan. Flyaway is blessed to be funded by the Mayor's Office of Youth, Children, and Families. It's called DCYF, the grant. And they do fund arts organizations, but primarily they fund more social service oriented organizations that serve youth. So they're constantly on me to do a cost allocation plan and have a predictable process for anticipating what funding is going to be next year. And I'm just like, that is so not how the arts get funded. So I would say there's consistency in what's happening. What is new since Trump took power is the political attack inside the funding. We lost our NEA grant. We lost our California Humanities grant, which a lot of people don't know happened. California Humanities canceled all of its projects and unfunded them all. Wow. And there's just tremendous confusion about what one might count on moving forward. the Bay Area has some amazing progressive funders that, for example, our last project was deeply rooted in the transgender community, which is a community under attack. Our primary collaborative partner, the Turkex Taylor Initiative, is a coalition of many interests, and is also representing the interests of and embodying the interests of the trans community. So, I had to go to one of the foundations and say, are you going to pull the funding on us? Like, are you going to be there for the promise you've made to us? And they were very committed, and a few funders are very committed, and others we're just not sure. The other big word going on right now is furlough. There are arts organizations, small arts organizations that don't have enough money to continue. Even to pay the measly little fees they pay their staff, or some of them don't even have staffs. They're more collective, with horizontal power structures. And so the word furlough is very big right now. People are going in furlough with uncertainty about when their programming can resume. And I find this really devastating, partly because of, something Eric said is that, artists in some ways are the bedrock of continuity of creation. And we're losing that bedrock right now because of unstable funding, because of the literal attacks on us via funding being taken away.
Wow, that's devastating, Joe, to hear about the California Humanities, because they receive money from the National Endowment for the Humanities, right?
Yeah, I think that was the pathway of the funding being just, we got a letter saying your grant is canceled. Like, oh, okay.
Joe, one more question on this, because we're dealing with this with public radio. I mean, we've been defunded for the first time. Sadly, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting just dissolved its board, which is tragic when you look at all the incredible documentaries and media outlets, especially in marginalized communities, that they funded. And so what is it like, Joe, now that so many more people are trying to get funding from fewer places?
Well, I can give you a little bit of an evidence-based response. We just completed our end-of-year donor appeal. Flyaway does not receive a lot of individual donations. We're not steeped in wealth culture because our work is extremely social justice driven. But we do have amazingly loyal fans. And, just evidence-based of the last 30 days, we had fewer donations, but they were larger. So a $30 donation became a $50 donation. A $100 donation became a $200 donation. So my conclusion from that is that those who are capable really recognize the crisis and are digging in and are giving. And that is hopeful to me.
The other thing that's amazing about Flyaway, Joe, is your dances are site specific, and many of them are on the side of buildings. And so your pieces are free for everyone to see, no matter their ability to pay.
Yeah, that's why we need a lot of funding on the front end.
Right.
There's no box office.
Right.
I would say another hopeful thing along those lines of, using public art to democratize public space is we're entering a 3-year collaboration with the San Francisco Public Libraries. And so we're going deeply hyper-local this year and are performing at a few library branches buried in the neighborhoods, not like mainstream big old, street festival venues. And so I'm really excited about, but we're performing in the daytime because of funding. We've lost the capacity right now to do large scale evening lighting, that adds another $100,000 to our budget. So we're, curtailing that for the moment, trying to be strategic in how we're spending our money, and going hyper local to places that, dance-based off-the-ground public art doesn't usually happen. And I'm pretty excited about our trajectory this year.
Joe Kreiter is artistic director of Flyaway Productions. They've got so many incredible events coming up. You can learn more about that at flyawayproductions.com. We're also joined today by Laura Raicovich, a New York City-based writer and curator, Eric Kupers, co-founder of the Dandelion Dancetheater, and professor of inclusive performance at Cal State University East Bay. On today's Authoritarian Playbook series, we're speaking with artists to find out how they are resisting and organizing under this administration. We're going to get Laura and Eric to also talk about funding. But before we do, we've got a number of emails from listeners who say thank you so much for your work. And let's hear from Judy in San Francisco. Hi, Judy. Thanks for holding.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, as a library retiree, I'm really thrilled to hear what Joe just said, because I try to go to all of her shows. But I was calling about two groups. The Yerba Buena Garden Festival is a beautiful festival that goes on for months and months, and it has international acts, music and dance. And I remember one Saturday morning, I had gotten bludgeoned by some news on the radio, and I went down there, and they had I don't even remember which act it was. They have people from all different countries, and and then they had this beautiful, festive, joyful, it wasn't particularly political, but it was just full of joy and beauty and fun, and I'm like, yes, this is what we want, This is the world we're fighting for. So that's, even that's one use of the arts. And the other group I wanted to call out was, of course, the venerable San Francisco Mime Troupe, which is so much fun, but also so educating every year. And I know they're suffering a lot, so if you want to donate, that's a good place to donate. But they've been fighting since the days when we really had a lot of hope, and we're just kind of trying to build new things, to now when we're just trying to prevent the bad things.
Yeah,
So
Judy, these are great. Thank you so much, and we should invite them on. If you go to the Mime Troupe website, it says never silent, always revolutionary. The Youth Theater Project turns 30 this spring, so we'll definitely have them on. Our goal with the Spotlight on the Youth Fund is to create a resource that can ensure that we continue to serve our local youth for many years to come. And then thank you for highlighting the Yerba Buena Gardens Festival, because on Monday, January 19th, they're having an event for MLK Day. It's going to be an MLK Music Festival, 1 to 3:30, Monday, January 19th at the Great Lawn Mission between 3rd and 4th in San Francisco. Great recommendations. Thank you so much, Judy. Nice to hear from you. We've got about 8 or so minutes left, and I wonder, Laura, do you have a brief comment on funding and what you're hearing from fellow artists about where we are right now?
Well, I think that we've had a major structural problem in terms of funding for arts and culture in the United States since the founding of this country. This is nothing new. It's just far more extreme, because now even the philanthropies that used to be able to fund arts and culture are being censored by the government, because they are in effect being threatened to lose their 501c3 status, or 501(c)(3), whatever their nonprofit status is. So I do think that there is like a very and Joe, I think you're right. Like, we are also, the self-censorship is really real, because there is such a huge fear amongst, oftentimes, not the people who are working within the organization, but the people who are governing the organization, meaning the boards. And so there is this kind of irrational self-censorship that happens. And then there's also, I want to make a distinction between the self-censorship that happens for fear of losing funding or existential fears, and also like personal fear of staff members who are perhaps, single parents, as many of my colleagues were at the Queens Museum, where they need a job that has health insurance because of all the other problematic things that our country doesn't do to support people who need to earn a living wage to survive. So, I think that that what I want to say is a little bit more structural about funding, which is that it has always depended on the largesse of philanthropy and wealth. Culture has in the United States, because of the paltry nature of federal funding. I will say that, many local local municipalities and regions have quite significant funding. Like, for example, the city of New York gives more arts funding away than the entire National Endowment for the Arts. Think about that for a half a second and how ridiculous. But I think that the other thing that has come out of COVID that is something that we need to put a very fine point on is the consolidation of wealth and power through the enormous wealth that was piled up and built by a very small universe of people during the pandemic. And I think that that wealth gap cannot be underestimated in terms of its impact and influence on our current condition of authoritarianism in the United States, and the problematics, and I think also the increasingly visible problematics of people not being able to buy groceries or pay their rent, or be able to afford their lives. And so the affordability problem, I think, is being reflected, and I'm enormously grateful for the fact that Zoran Mandani was elected in New York. I think that is a bright spot on our political landscape. But I think he's got a really tough battle before him because of the power of those forces, particularly in a city like New York, never mind whatever the federal government might have up its sleeve. So I think, one of the reasons that I want to reunite art and life in our consciousness in a much more robust way is that these structural problems that we see bearing out in all of the rest of society are actually the same as what's happening within culture. And so the need to address it and the need to undo it and remake it is very visible within the way that culture is structured. It's so clear, right? You look at any museum board or whatever, you understand what the power dynamics are. It's not confusing. It's very clear. So how do we undo it? Is it possible to imagine a way through that to get through the other side? And perhaps if we can make it make sense in this small universe of culture, we can make it make sense society-wide. I mean, that's something that I think that's why I think it's interesting, and also, of course, I know a lot about it. But I think it's interesting to experiment in the change making in arts and culture because of that mirroring, that very direct mirroring between the smaller space of culture and the bigger space of the larger society. Because I think the ills are so profoundly intermingled. So yeah, that's what I would say about the structural piece.
And if we can end by talking about young artists at this time. Joe, you said when you were working as an artist in your 30s, it was very, very different. And Eric, you are a professor of inclusive performance at Cal State East Bay. What are you hearing from young people who want to get into the arts? What are those conversations like?
Well, I think a lot of the students that I work with don't have a clear sense that there's a place for them to make money from the arts, that's not something that they've been brought up to think of as a path. And while that's sad in some ways, it also, what I hear from them is a lot about wanting to make the arts part of their life, whatever they do, whether it's the way that their career looks, or is it how they go into nonprofit organizing, or being a therapist, or being a nurse, and how can they use movement, and how can they use creativity and creative writing. And I think we're at a place, just to touch on the funding question as well, that there's so many levels to the way the arts are supported. And one of them is financial funding, and which is really important to fight for. Another way is just to look at resources in general, and that we as artists and as organizations, we have a lot of resources, and we often have things that other people need that we don't realize they need, and then the things we need other people have. And so I think one of the discussions that can happen now more is how can we support each other? For instance, at a university, public universities are being hit the same way that the arts are. We're losing funding so much. And so we can't afford to bring in artists in the way we used to for workshops, for performances. But we do have space, and we do have hungry audiences wanting to learn about the arts and wanting teaching. And so how can we sort of put those puzzle pieces together so artists that need space and that need an audience can come and share with our students who otherwise aren't getting a lot of exposure to the arts? And there's so many different ways we can look at that how our needs and our gifts that each of us have can fit together.
And I guess I
And
just
Joe,
want to add to that, because I think that people give the arts and cultural organizations the short shrift. We are such creative, our creative brains. When you put us in a situation where our backs are against the wall, when we've got to produce some money from a stone, we can do that. And I think that a lot of cultural organizations get the short shrift on their not only their creativity, but their ability to manage budgets extremely intelligently. And I think there's a lot that can be learned from us.
and just quickly, Joe, 30 seconds. Can you tell us a bit about Flyaway's Girl Fly, which is an artist as activist summer program for youth?
Girlfly's entered its 20th year, and it's a summer program where we pay San Francisco-based youth to come and enter the artist as activist trajectory. And our thought is that not that everyone in the program, or perhaps anyone in the program, is headed to be a professional artist, but everyone in the program is headed toward a life where creativity is primary and how one thinks about how to be best in the world. And that's a really important part of the program.
Joe Kreiter is choreographer and artistic director of Flyaway Productions. Laura Raicovich is a New York City-based writer and curator and initiator of Fall of Freedom, a national call for cultural resistance in the U.S. Eric Kupers is co-director of Dandelion Dancetheater, professor of inclusive performance at Cal State East Bay, and an organizer with The People versus Project 2025. Thank you all so much for your work, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you. You can find all of the articles and information we shared at kalw.org or in the episode notes. Thanks to Johanna Miyake for producing today's show and Kevin Vance for engineering our show. And thank you for joining us. Join us again next Monday to learn more about the latest from the administration's Authoritarian Playbook and find out how the public is responding. I'm Rose Aguilar. This is KALW San Francisco Bay Area.
Trump's campaigns and all these lawyers working for Trump who were orchestrating a legal strategy to block the certification using primarily fake electors.
Kara Lennig and Aaron Davis are co-authors of the new book, Injustice: How Politics and Fear Vanquished America's Justice Department. Thank you so much for your work on this very important book, and thank you for joining us. I'm Rose Aguilar. You can find all of the articles and information we shared at kalw.org or in the episode notes. Thanks to Johanna Miyake for producing today's show and Kevin Vance for engineering our show. And thank you for joining us. Join us again next Monday to learn more about the latest from the administration's Authoritarian Playbook and find out how the public is responding. I'm Rose Aguilar. This is KALW San Francisco Bay Area.